The courtyard of the Bell and Harrow coaching inn was frozen solid at midnight, and Margaret Hale stood in the middle of it, with her breath coming out in short, visible clouds, her gloved hands gripping one handle of a trunk that weighed more than she had anticipated when she had packed it 4 hours ago in a bedroom that was no longer hers. The lantern above the stable arch threw a thin orange light across the cobblestones, and the cold was the kind that found the gaps in wool and settled there. She had not cried in the carriage. She had not cried in the dining room, which had been considerably more difficult. She had done the arithmetic instead. The distance to Salford, the hour of the first northbound coach, the name of the woman at the school who kept a spare key and would not ask questions before dawn, and the arithmetic had held her upright through 40 miles of dark road. Now the trunk needed to move 6 feet to the left, and her right hand was shaking, and she stood still for one moment and let it shake, because there was no one in the courtyard to see it, and because she had earned 30 seconds of honest reaction before she went back to planning. She was wrong about being alone. A man in plain traveling clothes stepped out of the shadow near the horse trough. Not a groom, not a postilion, but a broad-shouldered figure who moved with the deliberate economy of someone accustomed to working sites rather than drawing rooms. He had been watching the ostlers and had turned at the sound of the trunk being set down on the cobbles. His gaze went to her face first, then dropped to the trunk, and something in his expression shifted with the particular quality of a man who has just registered something he did not expect. The trunk was large and plain and practical, stenciled on the side in black paint with the name and address of the Hale Subscription School, Salford. He crossed the courtyard in 8 strides and stopped 3 feet from her. And when he spoke, his voice was direct and not unkind, but it was the voice of a man who expected a straight answer. "That trunk," he said. "Where did you get it?" Margaret looked at him. She looked at the trunk. She looked back at him. "I packed it," she said, "this evening, into a hired carriage, which I have just descended from. The school's name is on it." "Yes," Margaret said, "I am aware. The Hale School's administrator is a man named—" He stopped. He looked at her again, more carefully this time, the way an engineer looks at a structure he has been reading about for 2 years and is now seeing for the first time in elevation. "The administrator has been corresponding with me for 26 months about the Eastern Wing expansion." "The administrator," Margaret said, "has been corresponding with everyone from behind a name that was not hers, because the lease was held in the name of her husband's solicitor, and the subscription patrons in 1822 were not yet prepared to write their quarterly checks to a woman." She pulled off her right glove and held up her hand, and her ring finger was bare. "I am the administrator, Sir Jonah, and I am going to Salford." He was silent for a moment, not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man rearranging a large number of things he believed to be true. Then he reached down and took the other handle of the trunk. He did not ask permission. He did not offer a pleasantry. He simply lifted his side, and the weight distributed. And for the first time in 4 years, a man reduced her load instead of adding to it. Margaret registered this fact with the precision she applied to everything, and said nothing, and walked with him toward the coach. 2 hours earlier, the Crail dining room had been exactly what Bertram had designed it to be. 30 guests, 3 courses, candlelight off the silver and the crystal. The anniversary dinner that was meant to display the household at its most accomplished. Margaret had sat at the far end of the table from her husband, and had been, as she had been for 4 years, entirely competent. She had managed the seating, the menu, the conversation, the flowers, and the temperature of the room. And she had done it invisibly, which was how Bertram preferred things done. He had raised his glass at 9:30, and 30 people had raised theirs. And he had smiled at the table with the particular smile of a man who has been building to something. 4 years, Bertram Crail said, and I find myself reflecting, as a man will, on the roads not taken. He paused, and his smile widened fractionally. "I should have married your younger sister." The table laughed. Not all of it, and not loudly, but enough. The particular social laugh that acknowledges a joke and distances itself from responsibility for it. 3 of the women did not laugh. Margaret noticed which 3, because Margaret noticed everything. She looked down at her hand on the table. She looked at the ring on her finger. She thought about the letter she had received that morning from the school's head teacher, reporting that the waiting list had reached 91 names and asking for guidance on the Eastern Wing timeline. She thought about the quarterly report she had signed, as she always signed it, with the name of an administrator who did not exist. She thought about the 4 years she had spent making herself smaller and quieter and more useful and less visible. And she thought about how none of it had been sufficient. And she thought about how the insufficiency had always been the point. The ring came off very easily. It had always been slightly too large. She set it against the foot of Bertram's wine glass, where he would see it the moment he looked down. And she raised her eyes to his face and said, in the same tone she used for household instructions, "Go propose tonight, then. Augusta is at Cheshire. I imagine she will receive you." The table went completely silent. Margaret turned to the footman standing at the sideboard. "Thomas," she said, "would you bring the carriage round, please? I have a journey to make." Thomas, who had worked for the household for 11 years and who had a very clear idea of how things stood in it, said, "Yes, Mrs. Crail," and left the room without looking at Bertram. Margaret stood, set her napkin on the table, and walked out through the doors that Thomas had already opened for her. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her she needed to see. The coach moved north through the dark, and Margaret sat upright against the seat and did not waste the time. She counted what was already irretrievable. 30 guests, which meant 30 conversations that would begin at breakfast and spread by afternoon. The footman, Thomas, had left the room in full view of the cook, the parlor maid, and Bertram's valet, which meant the servant's account would be circulating before dawn. And servants' accounts were always more accurate than the official version. Bertram would have told his version of events within the hour. She knew him well enough to know he would frame it as concern, as a husband's patience exhausted by an unstable wife. And his version would reach the people it needed to reach before she had a chance to offer any alternative. None of this was recoverable. She did not spend any time wishing it were. Sir Jonah Whitfield rode the same northbound coach as far as the Manchester Junction. Sitting across from her in the dark interior, his long legs taking up more than his share of the floor space, without any apparent awareness that this was the case. He had offered no commentary on what she had told him in the courtyard. He had asked one question as the coach pulled out of the Bell and Harrow yard. "Are you going to your father?" "No," Margaret said. He waited. "My father will ask me to go back," she said. "He will ask very kindly, and he will mean it kindly, and it will make no difference to the outcome. I am going to the school." Jonah was quiet for a moment in the way that was. She was already learning, not disagreement, but recalibration. The pause of a man adjusting his calculations to new information. "The Eastern Wing," he said finally. "The Eastern Wing," she agreed. They did not speak again until the Manchester Junction, where he descended with a nod that contained, she thought, a degree of respect not entirely present in the courtyard. She watched the coach pull away from the window and then turned back to her calculations. At the Salford office at first light, Margaret sat down at the desk she had never sat at in person and opened the quarterly report. The head teacher, Mrs. Forster, had made tea without being asked and had set it at Margaret's elbow without comment, which was exactly the response Margaret had hoped for and had not been certain of. She dipped the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the title of the report, and then she wrote, in the space where the administrator's invented name had appeared for 3 years, her own, Margaret Hale. She stopped. She looked at it. She started again and stopped again after the M. The third time she wrote it through without stopping, and the ink was steady by the end. And she set the pen down and read the name back to herself in the gray morning light coming through the office window, and found that it looked exactly right. The fiction of the administrator dissolved within the first week, not dramatically, but practically. Margaret was present, Margaret was conducting the business, and there was no plausible mechanism for pretending otherwise. She met with the subscription patrons in person, one by one, at the school rather than at any of their houses, because the school was her ground, and she intended them to understand that from the beginning. She sat at the head of the table in the small meeting room and opened the ledgers herself and walked each patron through the figures in plain language. And she answered their questions directly, and she did not apologize for being there. Most of them stayed. 2 required a second meeting. One wrote a letter of resignation that arrived 3 days after his visit and was replaced within a fortnight by 2 new subscribers whose daughters were on the waiting list. The teaching staff she addressed in the main hall on the second morning, standing at the front of the room with the enrollment register under her arm. "You have been working for this school for between 1 and 7 years," she told them. "The work has not changed. The name signing the correspondence has. If you have questions about what that means for your positions or your salaries, I am in the office each morning from 7. Otherwise, I will see you in your classrooms." Mrs. Forster, who had been at the school since its founding and who had always known perfectly well who the administrator was, said nothing. She simply nodded once, in the manner of a woman confirming what she had long suspected would eventually come to pass. The waiting list, freed from the administrative delay that had accumulated during the years of correspondence by proxy, began moving. 3 new students enrolled in the first 10 days. The Eastern Wing expansion, the project that had occupied 6 months of letters between Margaret and Jonah, moved from proposal to active planning. Bertram's solicitor's letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner. It was 4 pages long and very precisely worded, and Margaret read it twice, the second time making notes in the margin with a pencil. The letter stated that Margaret's jointure, the annual sum settled on her at the time of the marriage, was contingent on her residence in the Crail household, and that her continued absence constituted a breach of the terms under which it had been granted. It stated further that her father's existing commercial arrangements with the Crail business interests were not unaffected by the state of the marriage, and that the goodwill that had sustained those arrangements was a matter Bertram was prepared to reconsider. It implied, in language carefully chosen to imply without stating, that the school's lease, held in the name of Bertram's solicitor as a formality of the original arrangement, might be subject to legal review should the current situation continue. The implication about the lease was the part that required the most careful reading, because it was the part that was intended to frighten her into compliance before she had time to consult anyone who knew the law. She was still sitting with the letter when Jonah arrived. He had come, ostensibly, to review the building accounts for the Eastern Wing with the contractor. He came through the front door, spoke briefly to Mrs. Forster in the hallway, and walked into the office where Margaret was sitting with the letter open on the desk and Bertram's junior clerk, a young man named Peel, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier and was now perched on a chair near the window with the expression of someone performing a difficult duty, waiting for her response. Jonah read the room in approximately 3 seconds. He did not offer Margaret any reassurance. He did not address the clerk. He moved a chair from against the wall, set it down between Margaret and the door, and sat in it with the unhurried solidity of a man who has chosen a position and intends to hold it. Peel looked at Jonah. Jonah looked at Peel with the expression of a man who has supervised 200 navvies and is entirely comfortable waiting. "You were saying," Margaret said to the clerk, "that the lease review was a matter of some urgency." Peel cleared his throat. "Mr. Crale's position is that the current arrangement regarding the lease was always understood to be—" "The lease was drawn up in 1820, Margaret said. "The school has operated continuously under that arrangement for 6 years. The subscription income, the patron list, and the building improvements are all documented in these ledgers, which are available for inspection. If Mr. Crale's solicitor intends to challenge the lease, he will need to file in the appropriate court and present his grounds, at which point I will present mine." She set the letter flat on the desk and folded her hands on top of it. "Is there anything else?" Peel looked again at Jonah, who had not moved or spoken or changed his expression in any way. "No," the clerk said. "I don't believe there is." He left. Jonah remained in the chair for another full minute after the front door closed, as though ensuring the departure was complete. And then he stood and moved the chair back to the wall without comment. "The lease," he said, "is not actually challengeable," Margaret said. "The grounds he's implying don't exist." But the implication was enough to frighten Mrs. Forster and 2 of the junior teachers, and that was what it was designed to do. Jonah picked up the contractor's file from the desk. "The Eastern Wing," he said, and sat down again, and they got to work. The Eastern Wing accounts were detailed and required attention, and Jonah had developed the habit of appearing at the school on days when his schedule in Manchester permitted it, which turned out to be most days. He reviewed the building accounts. He inspected the proposed structural addition with the contractor. He sat in on one patron meeting, at Margaret's invitation, in a capacity that was formally described as that of principal benefactor, and that functioned, in practice, as a signal to the room that the school had serious backing. Margaret did not question his reasons for being present, because the work was real, and his presence had a measurable effect on the staff's confidence. The junior teacher stood straighter when he was in the building, not from admiration, but from the particular reassurance of knowing that someone large and competent and entirely unbothered by Bertram Crale's social position was on the premises. One evening, when the contractor had gone and Mrs. Forster had locked the classroom wing, they worked late in the office, cross-checking the construction ledger against the subscription income projections. The lamp was low, and the room was quiet, except for the scratch of pencils and the occasional sound of pages turning. And they had been working for 2 hours in the easy, wordless rhythm of people who have learned how the other thinks. Margaret reached for the reference volume on the corner of the desk at the same moment Jonah did. His hand closed over hers on the cover. Not roughly, not deliberately. Simply the result of 2 people moving toward the same object at the same speed. He did not withdraw immediately. She did not pull away. They remained that way for a visible count of seconds, both of them looking at the ledger in front of them rather than at each other. And then both returned, without comment, to the columns of figures. Margaret found the reference she needed. Jonah made a note in the margin of his page. Neither of them remarked on what had happened, because neither of them had the language for it yet, and because the figures still needed checking, and because some things are better left in the silence, where they can be examined privately. Jonah walked back toward the city that night along the river road, and he stopped on the bridge over the Irwell and stood there with his hands on the iron rail and looked down at the black water moving below him. He stood there longer than any problem with the Eastern Wing required. When he finally turned to continue walking, he looked back once toward the school's lit upper window, where the lamp was still burning, and then he put his collar up against the wind and walked on. Augusta Hale arrived at the school on a Tuesday morning without any warning. Having traveled from the family's Cheshire house on the early coach without, as she admitted immediately, telling their father she was going. She was younger than Margaret by 12 years, and the world had always been very clear about which of the Hale sisters was the prettier one and which was the useful one. And Augusta had grown up in the knowledge of her own value in the particular currency that the world traded in, which had not made her happy and had not made her unkind, but had made her, Margaret thought, watching her sister stand in the school hallway with her traveling coat still on and her face showing something that looked very much like apprehension, profoundly lonely. Bertram came to Cheshire, Augusta said, before Margaret could speak. 3 weeks ago, and again last week. Father let him in both times. Father thinks it can all be mended. I know what Father thinks, Margaret said. I need you to know something first, Augusta said, before I say the rest of it. She looked at Margaret directly, which was not something they had done much of in recent years. I heard the plan, the whole of it. I was in the hall outside Father's study when Bertram came the first time, and I heard what he told Father about why he said what he said at the dinner. Margaret waited. It wasn't a slip, Augusta said. He told Father it was a slip. He told everyone it was a slip. It was not. His money is very nearly gone. There's a mill investment that failed 2 years ago, and he's been managing the appearance of solvency ever since. He needed a separation that looked like your fault so he could keep Father's goodwill and the Hale commercial connections. And then he needed me to be available. Augusta stopped. He told Father that I had always been the better match, that it was a shame the elder daughter had been put forward first. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the classroom wing, a girl was reciting a geography lesson aloud, her young voice carrying clearly through the walls. He has been very attentive, Augusta continued, in the particular way of a man who has decided what he needs and is going about acquiring it. And Father is not a bad man, but he is a man who sees a solution and does not look at what it costs. What are you going to do? Margaret asked. Augusta looked at her steadily. I have already done it. I told Bertram last Thursday that I would not receive him again. I told Father the same. She paused. I need you to understand that I am not doing this for you. I mean, I am glad it helps you, but that is not why. I have spent 26 years being managed and displayed and pointed in directions that suited everyone except me, and I am finished with it. Her voice was very even. I don't want a husband. I don't want another house to run and another man to satisfy and another version of the same life with a different name on the door. Margaret looked at her sister for a long moment. Do you speak French? Margaret asked. Augusta blinked. Yes, and I play tolerably well, and my needlework is... Why are you asking me that? Because we have 47 girls on the waiting list who need a French and music instructor, and the woman I hired in February is leaving in June to be married, Margaret said. The salary is 12 shillings a week and the hours are 7 to 4. There is a room above the school that Mrs. Forster uses as a sitting room, but which has a bed in it and would serve as lodging if you needed it. Augusta was very still. You would be required to be useful, Margaret said, every day, reliably, without exception. It is not decorative work. I know what useful looks like, Augusta said quietly. I watched you do it for 20 years while everyone called it ordinary. They did not embrace. They looked at each other across the hallway of the school that Margaret had built while the world was looking the other way. And the look between them contained everything that the previous 20 years of managed rivalry had prevented them from saying, and it was more than an embrace would have been. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, Margaret said. Augusta answered without hesitation. Yes. Bertram, when he learned that Augusta had refused him and had gone to Salford, did what men do when the plan fails and the money is running short and the anger has nowhere useful to go. He became precise about it. The benefit assembly at the Marsden Rooms was a charitable occasion, a subscription concert in aid of the Manchester Infirmary, and it was attended by a significant portion of the people whose names appeared on the Hale School's patron list. Margaret had known she needed to be there. She had dressed accordingly and had gone alone because Augusta was teaching and because going alone was, at this point, simply the condition of her life. Lady Forsyth, who hosted the assembly and whose opinion functioned in Manchester's charitable society as a kind of weather system, was standing near the entrance when Margaret arrived. Margaret had met her 3 times. They were not intimate, but they were acquainted, and the acquaintance had always been cordial. Lady Forsyth looked at Margaret, looked through her, and turned to speak to the woman on her left. It was done in full view of the room. It was done in full view of Mr. Alderton, who subscribed £40 annually to the school, and of Mrs. Crane, whose 3 daughters were enrolled, and of Councillor Bray, whose civic endorsement had been instrumental in the school's original licensing. It was done with the practiced ease of a woman who has performed this particular social maneuver many times and knows exactly how much damage it causes. Margaret stood where she was for 3 seconds, long enough to ensure that the room had seen her receive it and had seen her remain standing. And then she crossed to speak to Mr. Alderton, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, and who spoke to her for 6 minutes about the Eastern Wing, which was 6 minutes more than she had expected. She left before the second interval. The examination hall was dark when she reached the school. She did not light the lamp. She sat down on one of the long benches in the middle of the room, in the dark. And she sat there with her hands in her lap and her back straight. And she thought about 90 girls whose futures were partially dependent on whether the people who had witnessed tonight's performance decided that a woman who had been publicly cut by Lady Forsyth was someone they still wished to associate with. That was what broke through in the end, not the humiliation, not the cold calculation of it. The girls? She heard the door. Jonah came in without a lamp, which meant he had seen the dark and come in anyway. He did not say anything reassuring. He did not tell her it would be all right. He crossed the room and sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and he was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about who I was before the knighthood." Margaret waited. "My father was a navvy," Jonah said. "Not a foreman, not a contractor. A navvy. He dug the Bridgewater extension with his hands. I grew up in a camp on the edge of a cutting, and I taught myself to read from a canal engineer's discarded manuals because there was nothing else available, and because I had decided, at the age of 9, that I was going to understand how things were built." He paused. "By the time I was 30, I had built contempt for your class into the structure of how I thought about the world. Every titled man who looked past me at a sight meeting, every woman who addressed her questions to the man standing behind me rather than to me. I took all of that, and I made it into a principle. I told myself that no one born to ease and position was worth my serious attention. And I believed it. And it was comfortable to believe it." He was looking at the dark windows at the far end of the hall. "I spent 2 years in correspondence with the most capable administrator I had encountered in 20 years of building and funding institutions," he said. "I told myself it was because the work was good. It was because the work was good. But I also told myself Every time the letters impressed me. That the administrator must be an unusual sort of man. Practical, unsentimental, clear about money. And when I found out the administrator was you, my first response was to recalibrate everything about what I believed a woman of your position could be. He stopped. That recalibration took me about 30 seconds in a frozen courtyard, and I have been reckoning with what it means ever since. I was as blind as every man who looked at you and saw a merchant's daughter playing at administration. I just came at it from the other direction. Margaret looked at the dark windows too. Bertram looked at me and saw a useful purchase, she said. You looked at your correspondent and assumed a man. The error is different in kind, but the mechanism is the same. She turned her head slightly. What are you going to do with the reckoning? I am already doing it, Jonas said. His hand found hers on the bench between them, and she did not move away. And they sat there in the dark examination hall, while the night watchman's lantern passed slowly across the window and moved on down the street, and the room stayed quiet around them. The morning of the examination day, Jonah arrived before the students, which meant he arrived before 7, which meant he was carrying benches through the side door when Margaret came in from the office with the examination papers under her arm. They worked without speaking, because they had learned each other's rhythm well enough by now that speech was largely unnecessary for the physical logistics, and because both of them knew what the day contained and had made their separate decisions about it. Margaret moved through the hall, setting papers on desks and checking the seating order against the enrollment register. Jonah shifted benches into the configuration she had described the previous afternoon. He stopped in the middle of the room with a bench in his hands and set it down. I want to ask you something, he said. Margaret looked up from the register. Not about the school, Jonah said. Not about Crail, not about the examination, not about the lease. About you. He looked at her directly, in the plain, unhurried way that was simply how he looked at everything he was trying to understand. When this is over, when today is done, and the legal business is settled and your name is on the door, what do you want? For yourself. No one had ever asked her that. She was aware, standing in the examination hall at 10 minutes past 7 in the morning with examination papers in her hand, of the precise shape of the gap the question had just filled, and of how long it had been empty. The school, she said, my name on it, properly in law, not as a fiction. 90 girls, and the next 90 after them. She paused. And I want not to be managed. I want to make a decision and have it be my decision, without it being permitted or ratified or condescended to by someone who assumes the right. She stopped. That is what I want. Jonah crossed the room to where she was standing. He was carrying nothing now. He stopped in front of her and he kissed her once, measured and deliberate in the way he did everything that mattered to him. And when he stepped back, his expression was the same as it always was, which was to say entirely serious and entirely present. I will be in the front row, he said, regardless of what happens. He picked up the bench and carried it to the window. Margaret looked at the examination papers in her hand, and then she went back to the seating order, and the hall began to fill. The students came first, 90 of them in their best dresses, filing into the hall with a particular combination of anxiety and excitement that examination day produced, finding their seats, setting out their pencils. The patrons arrived at 9:30, 40 of them, Mr. Alderton and Mrs. Crane and Councillor Bray among them, taking the chairs arranged along the side walls. 2 civic officials from the Manchester Board of Trade arrived at 9:45, having been invited by Councillor Bray, and sat near the back. Augusta stood with the teaching staff along the east wall, her back straight, her face composed. Sir Jonah Whitfield took the chair in the front row, directly in front of the examiner's table, and sat with his hands on his knees and his attention on the room. Margaret stood at the front of the hall and waited for the clock to reach 10. At 7 minutes past 10, the rear doors opened. Bertram Crail entered from the back of the hall and walked forward through the rows of seated students with the unhurried confidence of a man who has decided that the situation requires his presence, and that his presence will resolve it. He was dressed well. He had the appearance of a concerned and reasonable man, which was the appearance he had been preparing. He stopped near the front of the room and addressed the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bertram said, "I apologize for the interruption. I hope you will forgive a husband's concern. There has been a misunderstanding in my household, a private matter that has unfortunately been allowed to take on a public dimension. And I am here simply to speak with my wife and to ensure that the situation is resolved as quietly as possible, for the benefit of everyone present." He looked at Margaret with an expression of patient forbearance. "Margaret, I think we should step outside." Margaret looked at him. She set down the examination paper she was holding and picked up the school's annual record from the table behind her. She opened it to the first page. "In the year 1820, she said, in the same clear, carrying voice she used when addressing the hall, the Hale Subscription School enrolled its first 11 students, funded by an initial subscription of 6 patrons. The founding administrator was recorded under a proxy name at the request of the leaseholder." She turned the page. "In 1821, enrollment reached 23. In 1822, 38, with a waiting list of 14. In 1823, the year of my marriage to Mr. Crail, enrollment stood at 51. She looked up. "The school predates the marriage by 3 years. Its operation, its accounts, its patron correspondence, and its expansion were managed throughout the marriage by me, without Mr. Crail's knowledge, assistance, or interest." Bertram's expression had shifted. He was recalibrating, the way men do when the room is not responding as the room was supposed to respond. "Margaret," he said more quietly, "this is not the place." "Mr. Alderton," Margaret said, "you have subscribed to this school for 4 years. Mrs. Crane, your daughters have been enrolled for 3. Councillor Bray, your endorsement of the school's license was given in 1822. She looked at each of them as she named them. "You are present today because this institution is real, because the work it does is real, and because the women who built it and teach in it and learn in it are real." She turned back to Bertram. "The phrase you spoke at our anniversary dinner was not a slip. You told my father it was a slip. You told your solicitor it was a slip. It was a calculation. Your mill investment failed in 1824. Your finances have been managed for appearance for 2 years. Augusta had just come into an independent legacy. You needed a separation that appeared to be my fault, and you needed my sister to be available." The hall was completely still. 90 girls were not moving. "I am filing for legal separation," Margaret said. "On grounds I am prepared to enumerate in full if you remain in this room. I am retaining the school, the lease of which will be redrawn in my own name. I am removing my name from the Crail household accounts and returning the jointure in its entirety, which I am informed will not, in your current financial situation, be unwelcome." She closed the annual record. "I am not your wife, in any sense that the word has meaning. I have not been for some time, and I am asking you to leave." Bertram looked at her. He looked at the room. He opened his mouth. Jonah stood up. He did it quietly, without drama. simply rising from his chair in the front row and standing with his arms at his sides. The man to his left, Mr. Alderton, stood a moment later. Then Mrs. Crane, then Councillor Bray, then the two civic officials at the back, then, one by one, the remaining patrons, rising from their chairs along the wall until the entire adult portion of the room was standing, looking at Bertram Crail in absolute silence. Augusta straightened from the wall and stood with the teaching staff, and they stood too. Bertram looked at the room. He looked at the rows of standing people. He looked at his wife, who had not moved, and whose expression contained no triumph and no anger and nothing he could use. He turned and walked back through the hall the way he had come, and the rear doors swung shut behind him, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone outside diminished and was gone. Margaret looked at the hall. "I apologize for the interruption," she said. "We will begin the examination now." The legal separation took 6 weeks to complete. Margaret's solicitor, recommended by Jonah, who had used him for 3 commercial disputes and found him precise and unsentimental, filed the petition in the 2nd week of November. And Bertram's response was, as Margaret had predicted, more concerned with limiting the financial damage than with contesting the grounds. The jointure was surrendered. The Crail name was surrendered. Margaret signed the final document on a Thursday afternoon in the solicitor's office, and she wrote her name at the bottom of the page without stopping. And it was the same name she had been writing on school documents for 6 weeks, which was the name she had been born with. Augusta signed her teaching contract the same week and moved into the room above the school and proved to be an instructor of considerable ability. Not despite the 26 years of careful presentation and social management, it turned out, but because of them. Because she understood exactly how young women were taught to make themselves smaller, and she had decided, with the particular clarity of someone who has just seen the mechanism laid bare, to teach them something different. The waiting list cleared its first backlog in 4 years. 3 new patrons applied for subscription positions in December. The eastern wing framing went up in the first week of the new year. And Jonah was on site for the first 3 days of it, in his working clothes, doing what he always did when something was being built that he had invested in. On the evening the final separation paperwork was completed, Margaret walked out of the solicitor's office onto the street and stood for a moment in the cold air, holding the folder of documents that were the legal record of everything she was keeping and everything she was releasing. And she found that the weight of the folder was very light. She walked to the school. She went through the building, the classrooms, the examination hall, the office with the lamp still burning on the desk. And she turned off the lamp and picked up her coat and walked to the front door. She put her key in the lock and turned it. And the bolt went home with a sound that was entirely satisfying. And she stood on the step for a moment with the key in her hand. Jonah was on the pavement, not waiting in a carriage, not standing in a doorway, standing on the pavement in full view of the street, in the lamplight, in the plain way of a man who has decided that what he is doing requires no concealment and no explanation. He was wearing his working coat, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he looked at her with the same expression he always wore, which was serious and entirely present, and she had come to understand. The expression of a man paying complete attention. Margaret came down the step-off and walked to him, and they walked together along the street. And the night was cold and clear, and the city was going about its business around them, and neither of them said anything for a while because neither of them needed to. The brass plate arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, and the man from the foundry set it down on the front step and stood back and waited for instructions. It was a good plate, solid, well cast, the letters clean and deep. The Hale School. Jonah took the screws and the spirit level from the bag the foundry man had brought, and he climbed the 2 steps to the door and held the plate against the stone beside the entrance. And he looked back over his shoulder at Margaret, who was standing on the pavement below, with her arms crossed against the cold. "Here?" he asked. "Lower," she said. He moved it. "Left," she said. He shifted it a 1/4 inch. Margaret tilted her head. She looked at the plate and at the door, and at the building above the door where the windows of the examination hall caught the winter morning light. Down the street, a line of girls was waiting to be admitted. New applicants, the first intake of the new term, standing in their coats with their mothers beside them, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "There," Margaret said. "That is exactly where it goes." Jonah held the plate steady and began to drive the first screw, and the sound of it rang clean and bright in the February air. And Margaret stood on the pavement below and watched her name go up on the wall of the thing she had built, and found that she was entirely, precisely, completely where she had always been going.